Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is part 13 of this series, Metaphysics. And this is a subsection of that series where I give several talks on perception, which is as I mean it, is a topic of metaphysics. If we were just talking about eyes and brains, that would be biology, and if we were talking about, electrical activity, that would be neurology. But we're talking about the metaphysical aspects of perception, the sort of mysterious thing that we do when we take experience of an object. No one has ever been able to explain how we are conscious of objects. We know the equipment we use, eyes and ears and so forth, and our brains, but we don't know how we actually perceive. But I'm going to go in pretty deep into this. But before I can, because this is a big part of everything I talk about, I want to talk about the history of the word and how it came to have its current meaning, its current narrow meaning in the 20th century. Now, in this discussion, we're talking about the word perception, the history of this important word, and we're talking about only it in the English language. And so we have to go back to the beginning of the English language. Now, the English language isn't very old, and it's you can go back and see its roots in French and German and so forth. And it's got words that came from Latin, but then went through these other intermediate languages, and then they ended up in what's called early modern English. And that's the language of the Enlightenment, the period of the great philosophers of the European Enlightenment in the 1700s. So that's the period that we're most interested. That's when English began to really flower as a language on its own. That's the era of the King James Version of the Bible, which was first published 1611, and the era of Shakespeare, who died in 1616. Now, something to know about this period, this early period of the English language, is there were no dictionaries. People who were literate, they learned from reading, and they remembered the meanings. Shakespeare, interestingly, he invented 3,000 words. That's what they say. And these words are now in the unabridged Oxford Dictionary, every one of those. So it was a time when there wasn't an exact proper meaning of a word. It was entirely by usage and memory. And but it was a very high time of the English language, and a beautiful time. Language was beautiful, and all through the Enlightenment, if you read the philosophers, they like Hume and Locke. It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful and highly literate. And anyway, I want to talk about what the word perception meant then, and where it came from. It came through French. It came from another French word. It came from Latin. And the original word in Latin was percipere. And it comes from a root from Latin which meant to take. So by extension, you took knowledge or apprehension of something. And it didn't mean with the senses. It could mean with the senses, but you could all just as easily take knowledge through your mind by thinking or imagining or concocting something. So you could experience things that are physical outside yourself, like a lamp and a bar of soap, but you can also experience, your memories, your dreams, your thoughts, your insights about others and yourself, or you could imagine how it feels to be somebody else, which we call empathy. And all these are perception. I perceive them. So I take cognizance of them, or I become aware of them. So here, the word comes from the Latin perceptio. You'll often hear different versions of the Latin. I'm not a grammar person, but anyway, it means of receiving or collecting, perception, comprehension. See, originally it actually literally meant collecting. So if a landlord is collecting rents, That's a use of the word perception, that collecting. So, but you're collecting information, you're collecting knowledge. So from Latin percipere, perceive, and that is put together by the Latin root per, which meant through, and capio, which meant capture, seize, or understand. And it was coined by Cicero in the 1st century. He's the first we know of to have used the word, from 1st century BC, from percipio, to seize, conceive, perceive. So, so it could either mean conceive of something or perceive something with your senses. You got that? So, in short, in the Enlightenment, which is the way I'm using the term because those are the books that I was most interested in, was the books of the Enlightenment philosophers. Many of them who wrote in either English or Latin, but a lot of them wrote in English. I'm going to simplify what it meant. It meant to become aware of anything. So you could become aware of a thought, a concept, or you could become aware of, a book on the shelf over there because I see it with my eyes. I become aware of it. And similar to the broad sense with which we use the word see, because we can use that either for seeing things with our senses, like our eyes, but we can also mean it in its conceptual sense. So I see that lamp, but I can also say, I see that I was amiss in my remarks. I'm reflecting cognitively. So you could take experience with your senses or with your mind, with your intellect. In this original English form, I can perceive physical objects, but I can also perceive subjective mental phenomena. And so I'm going to give just a few examples of that mental phenomena, because today we would exclude these from the word perception. But in all my writing, I'm including them, and that's really important to understand. I'm using this in its classical, original sense, from the Latin as it was first used into English. So here's the things that I perceive that are not with my senses. I perceive my verbal thoughts, what we sometimes call my inner monologue, by talking to myself, my memories, my imagination, so my emotions like anxiety and things like that, happiness. I perceive that I have those experiences. I experience those. You can use the word perceive. My dreams, as I sleep, I perceive my dreams, and but not with my senses. Obviously, they're completely in me. My dreams, they're in my mind, and then later when I wake up, I perceive my memories of those dreams when I wake up. I perceive songs and tunes and poems that I either think up or that I remember. Sometimes you have a song in your head and you can't get it out of your head. Well, you're perceiving that song in your mind. I perceive insights about my actions, such as I can perceive that I was hypocritical or rude, at a party or something like that later. And I can perceive abstract concepts like that the number 4 is an even number. If I reflect on that, I go, yeah, it's an even number because it's evenly divisible by 2. And then I can perceive how it feels to be someone else. As I said, that's what we call empathy. Some people can't. They can't imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. But that's a kind of perception. I perceive in my mind what it would be like if I was them, and that helps me to understand them. And then even things like hallucinations, I perceive them even though they're not there. I could take a hallucinogenic drug and I could see the walls are dripping or something, but they're not really dripping, but I do perceive it. That's a fact. And then finally, as an example of something that doesn't have any external cause, it's internal, it's actually neural, is that there are phantom neural sensations like phantom limb pain or tinnitus, which is a buzzing in the ear, but there's not really anything in the room buzzing. It's something in your ear. It's a problem in the brain. And then there's one called scintillating scotoma, where you see like flashing lights in front of you, and for a period of time, and it's connected to a form of migraine headache. So that's a kind of hallucination. That's not psychological, it's actually physical, but it bypasses the senses. It happens in the brain. It's kind of like high pressure in the brain due to this swelling from a headache. Now, to show that the word used to have these, I wanted to share some dictionaries. These are actual scans from old dictionaries that are still online, luckily, and they're from the 1600s and 1700s. So this period I'm talking about, when this is how the word was used in philosophy and how I'm using it. So here's one: the act of perception, the act of perceiving, comprehending, or knowing. So you could comprehend something. It would be just as much a proper use of that word. And then we come to this dictionary, and we see that it meant the power of perceiving, knowledge, consciousness. You see that word is on there. And because anything that I can be conscious of, I could be said to perceive. So it's almost like saying I'm just conscious of that. I become aware of it. You can't really see a clock on the wall until you become aware of it. You kind of notice it, and then you perceive it. Before that, you're not really perceiving it because you haven't become aware of it. Okay, so next, here's another. Perception is the clear and distinct apprehension of objects offered to us without any inferring, any judgment concerning them. So we don't concern ourselves with whether they have an external cause, like you would see something across the room, or something internal, or something's a hallucination, or something's neural. It's just any object with no regard for its nature or cause, origin. Today, we no longer use the word perception in this broad sense, like the way we use the word see. Instead, we only mean with our sense organs, okay, like hearing and seeing. And now this says where that happened. So perception, that means in the subject of philosophy, which the action of the mind by which it refers sensations to external objects, phenomena, etc., as their cause. So it only refers to those things that are caused by something outside of you. This sense was brought to prominence in philosophy by Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796. This is important because we're going to get into this a bit. We're going to talk about what Reid's thinking was and why he narrowed the meaning of the word. But I want to say a couple things. Philosophers don't use the word this way all the time. So that's just false, as if that's how you use it in philosophy. Like there's a right way to use a word in pediatrics or something. But it's not that way. Philosophy you don't get taught how to use words when you go to get a PhD in philosophy. You use words as they're used, but depending on the context. You may mention how you're using a word, but there's no proper way. So that's false. So why is this false? And this is the current online, by subscription only, unabridged Oxford English Dictionary. This is the dictionary that used to be like 20 volumes in libraries, but they've taken it out. It's now online, and you subscribe. It was written from the mid-1800s to about 1928. It took so long to write. But this is sort of your final, source on the English language. It's the unabridged Oxford Dictionary called the OED. Now, that's one thing that's strange, that they're saying that in philosophy we say it like Reid did. We're going to get into Reid in a minute. But also it says that we're sensations to external objects. We mean by which we mean our perception refers to an external object. Well, how do you know there's an external object? Remember, you have hallucinations. You have tinnitus. When you first hear that buzzing, you start looking around. The same with scintillating scotoma, where you see what looks like broken glass in front of you. When I've had that experience, and I literally had to cover both eyes. I thought that maybe it was something in the room first. So this idea that you know the source and it's external is problematic. And also, as we're going to get into it deeply in this series, what do we mean by external? They don't mean outside your brain or outside your body, because your body and your brain are part of your internal world of experience. They mean it's external of your experience, not in your experience. A second world that's not in your experience. And I'll give some references to some videos where I talk about this. It's the whole crux of all my arguments, is that there is this idea that there's a second world, a world that you don't perceive and you have no evidence of. And philosophers have pointed out that there is no evidence of it. We take it on faith. Now they're saying that if proper use of the word perceive in philosophy is referring to this things in that world you can't perceive. So that's very, very strange. I know that sounds crazy, but I'll make it clearer. So now I'm coming now to the Dictionary of Philosophy that is like a very long, many volumes. It used to be at our library. They've removed all these reference books, but I luckily scanned this entry on perception. It says originally and most commonly down to the middle of the 18th century. It's much later than that. This is wrong. It goes all the way to the end of the 18th century. It meant cognition, thought, and sense in general, whether the faculty, the operation, or the resulting idea. But now let's scan down, and we come, and it says, perception is most properly applied to the evidence we have of external objects by our senses. And it says, Reid, intellectual powers. Now, they're quoting a book. You would think the book's by Reid, but it's not. It's very complicated what happened. There was this philosopher at the end of the Enlightenment, really when it was over, who kind of reacted to the ideas of the Enlightenment on perception, and he didn't like them. And he's not a very important philosopher. However, he greatly influenced our current world. Because for some reason, people really wanted to get away from the ambiguity of perception in this broad sense. And so they wanted to have a way to clarify a difference between anything internal and something that has an external cause. But remember, by external, I don't mean outside of your head, I mean outside of your experience. So they're referring to an occult theoretical world. To understand what I'm talking about by an occult theoretical world that they're referring to, I would have to say you could go back and watch parts 1, 2, and 3 of this series. We only perceive our own ideas, matter is a theoretical entity, and number 3, the unknowable outer world. Because this is what they're talking about. It exists in the unknowable outer world. And if you've never heard of it, it's because only philosophers talk about this and talk like this. Scientists, neuroscientists would refer to things we can't see because you only perceive your internal states. This comes from Reid, but I want to really diagnose these words. Most properly Well, first of all, that's not what dictionaries do. They don't tell you the proper use of a word. They tell you the history of the word, all the usages. So you have to define that either by saying how you're using a word, or people can figure it out through the context of how you're using it. But this idea that there's a proper way, you're not allowed to use the word another way, something's going on. I mean, I really, that's why this is a difficult video for me, because I've done my best to figure out what happened. I'm going to do my best to explain that, but it still doesn't add up. Why would they do this? They don't want you to use perception in the broad sense that it was always used by the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, and that I still do. So why not? Because what harm does it do? I'm going to show that the word was never replaced, and we don't have any way to speak of certain things, as you'll see, because they have limited it. It's by decree. It's not how dictionaries aren't done that way. Dictionary gives you the meaning from usage, not from somebody declaring something proper. All right. So perception is most properly applied to the evidence we have of external objects by our senses. What evidence do they give? Do you know, there's this movie, The Matrix, and I've mentioned it. In the movie, they hook a thing to the back of Neo's head, played by Keanu Reeves, and then he thinks he's experiencing the world, but he's really being fed stuff from a computer. This is a version of an experiment from philosophy called the brain in the vat experiment. It's not a real experiment, it's a thought experiment. Could you fool a brain into thinking it was experiencing the world around it? Yeah, theoretically you could. And so here they're saying that if Neo sees his desk at work, that's evidence that that's the real desk. But actually, Neo is in the Matrix. And then they pull him out of the Matrix, and then he sees the world as it really is. So notice that this is really weird, and notice that it's in a dictionary. Because notice that they're loading up a word, starting with this Reid, intellectual powers, which I'll tell you what that is. They're starting to load up a word with metaphysical assumptions and claims, which is absurd. The reason we use words to make arguments for our claims. We don't go look up, and the dictionary tells us the metaphysical reality that your perception is evidence of an external world it's not evidence of an external world. There's not necessarily an external world. That's my whole point I've been describing for, well, years. Years. Okay, so let's go on. When we look at these dictionaries, we find a lot of references to a guy named Sir William Hamilton, or Sir W. Hamilton. And he was the 9th baronet. He was a baron, and he lived in Scotland, like Reid did. He was a follower of Reid. He was an enthusiastic follower of Reid, who edited many editions of Reid's books later after Reid died. And so they turned to him to explain what Reid thought. But why would Reid be setting the new meaning of the word perception, limiting it down? Okay, I'm just showing dictionaries today. Old dictionaries, as I said, they start with the broad sense of the word. Okay? They don't even mention the senses. Or they can, they go to the senses and the mind. But here, the new dictionaries, this is the free dictionary online, it's a common online dictionary. It starts out with the process of perceiving something with the senses. An instance of this. But then in number 2, it does acknowledges the original meaning, but it puts it as second. The process or state of being aware of something. Insight or knowledge gained by thinking. So that is the original sense. So to their credit, they were able to fit that on. Really cheap dictionaries will just say, sense perception. Well, today. So this is the dictionary on my computer. I have an Apple Power Mac. And I turn it on here, and it has a little dictionary at the bottom. You click that, look up perception. The ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. Again, it's this new limited read form. Let's see, number 3 here. A way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something, a mental impression. Yeah, I guess so. I see what you mean, like that. Like I perceive what you mean by what you're saying. I guess that's what they mean there. So now, but this all sort of took place in the 20th century. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, there was a dictionary. It's the unabridged Webster's Dictionary from 1913, which is still used. Wiktionary, online free dictionary, uses the 1913 Webster's because it's in public domain. And anyway, let me give you the definition that they give, because it's very good. It's more like the traditional meaning. 1, the act of perceiving cognizance by the senses or intellect. So that's how I'm using it too. Apprehension by the bodily organs or by the mind. Okay, so you get this broadness. All right, so that's it. Now I'm going to explain what Reid was doing, because it was very weird. There is a value to being clear when you're talking about sense perception. And as I have said, the best way to do that is say the word sense perception. It's like, he has sense perception of this, as opposed to he perceives it. Just generally, if you want to specify, then specify. Okay. I'm going to read from a little teeny thing that I have here called How Reid Thought. Now remember, I said to best understand what I'm talking about, it would help if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and review parts 1, 2, and 3 of this series, which is kind of a lot of work, but I don't know how else you can do it. Or you can look up Mind-Body Problem, Wikipedia. That's kind of short. And that'll explain the same thing. When I perceive something, and in a lot of my videos, I use the example of a fire engine that's out in the yard because there's a fire in my condo complex. And I see the fire engine, it's red, it's quite interesting, to perceive with my eyes. And this is sense perception, eyesight that I'm talking about, which is a way of, that's something I can be aware of or conscious of or cognizant of. And I see that it's red and I see its shape, etc. Except those are not, I'm not perceiving it out there. Well, it feels like that. I'm really perceiving my own brain states, because the electromagnetic radiation that reflects off of the side of the fire engine comes and hits my eyes, and then the cones of my eyes, and then it goes down the optic nerve. Not as light, by the way, or color. It goes down the optic nerve as electricity. See, originally it was electromagnetic energy, which is only describable mathematically in cycles per second or hertz of light radiation, and then that is converted to an electrical signal by my body, and that also is in hertz, and it's energy, and that moves down my optic nerve into my brain, and then my brain creates the image of color. I don't get any color from the fire engine. So that's entirely formed by my brain to me. It's a subjective experience. This is common, ordinary neurology. The same is true of sound. If a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound out there. It makes a vibration, and that vibration reaches my eardrums, wiggles them, and then that vibration is converted again into an electrical signal, which is binary, and that goes to my brain, and then it's converted into sound. Sound doesn't actually reach my brain, nor does color. But all I can perceive is color, and all I can hear is sound. So I'm actually only perceiving my own inner neural states, according to contemporary science. So how do I know there's an actual fire engine out there, or what it's like? That's what we mean by the external world. We don't mean outside of my head, because if I lifted the top of my head and I put a mirror here and looked up, I could see my brain. So it's actually part of the world of experience too. I mean outside of my experience, which means I can't verify it exists. It's a theoretical entity. It's the unknowable outer world, as those videos I just mentioned are called. I said one of my videos is called Matter is a Theoretical Entity. That's number 2 of this series. And then number 3 is the unknowable outer world. And this will all be explained there if you can't get it here. But the point is, when we come back to Reid is saying that we do have evidence of this actual fire engine through our perceptions. But he admits that the sensations like the red and the sound and all that are in our mind or in our brain. He admits that. But he feels that somehow we know from that there are these things outside us, outside of experience in this unknowable world. And how does he argue that we know this? He says that he believes that it is a kind of natural magic. Now, how does this magic work, and why does he believe in it? You have to understand something about how Reid thought. Reid was very religious, and he believed, of course, that God created the world. And there was this thing called natural, it's like destiny. That God created things that made sense. So he created, and in a beautiful way and everything. So he created this magical power that we have to know that our sensations are of the outer world. Because God is so good. And so this is actually very similar to an argument by Aristotle. Aristotle thought the world is rational. And so the fact that we perceive things, he understood that we can't directly perceive the so-called outer world, which he totally knew about, the theoretical outer world. But he said, our organs are designed in a kind of ordered, rational way. So they're designed, that's their purpose, is to give us true information, even about things that we can't directly confirm. So again, it's like by providence. And that was the word Reid used. He called it natural providence. The funny thing is today, this is adopted by atheist philosophers that don't even believe in God or providence. They believe in evolution by accidents. So they have no basis at all to continue this idea that we know about the external world from our perception. But they're actually loading it into the definition of the word perception. Well, we don't realize this because we just look at thin abridged dictionaries. But if you go and you look at an unabridged dictionary, you see that that actually means those, that evidence we have of the outer world. That's what that's how you should use the word perception. So if Neo from the Matrix wants to say, when he's hooked up in the Matrix, but he knows it, let's say, wants to say, well, I perceive my desk. He can't say that. So what does he say? He can't say anything. He can't say he perceives his desk, because he knows that he's in the Matrix hooked up in the back of his head, and that's just something from a computer program. It's not from the natural outer world. It comes from outside of his brain, but it doesn't come from outside well, in a way, it comes from outside his experience. It comes from this unperceived computer somewhere. So you see the problem, that they're kind of taking their theory of the outer world and loading it into the definition of sense perception. So, and then saying all other perception, like a hallucination or a dream or something, none of that is perceived. Okay, there's a lot of problems with that. I don't know how much I'll get into it now, but just briefly, I thought, take this scenario. say there's this married guy, and he wakes up from a dream, and he's a little sweaty from the dream, and his wife says, what's the matter, dear? And he says, well, I just had this terrible nightmare. I was on this ship, and it was sinking, and there was captain with red hair, and he was like yelling, and then the sails were green, and she says, well, how do you know you had this dream? Well, I remember having it. Well, how do you know you remember having it? Now, he can't say I perceived my memory by reflecting. Like, the way I would say it to her, I'd say, well, I would use the word perceive. I say, well, now that you ask, well, when I reflect upon my memories, which I'm able to do, I see that I dreamed, because it obviously isn't still going on, so it was probably a dream. And I perceive in that memory that captain with the red hair and the sails, and I perceive my memory that they were green. But if I can't say the word that I perceive my memory of perceiving the dream, then how do I say I know? Well, it's some natural magic, I guess. It's a paradox. So it's a paradox caused by meddling with the word perception. Now, languages, including English, are living. The English language is a living language. It's always changing. That's normal. It changes all the time. But this isn't that. This is actually people going in and meddling. They're going in saying what's proper, and then it's sort of enforced. And when I wrote my first book, there were no PhD philosopher had any problem understanding what I meant by perception, because that's how they understood that it was used that way up until like 1800s. But and which is most of like half of philosophy was from before the 1800s. But other people, even educated people who were used to using dictionaries, said, oh, you're not using it right. That you don't understand what you're talking about. Perception is only with the senses. Well, it would seem like that today, but it's not. So that's all I have to say on this. I'm going to talk more about perception, but now you know what I mean by perception and what my source is and what happened, and you know a little more. And we'll not have to deal with that again, or if I do, I'll refer to this video. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the other side with part 14. Take care.